friends and Hannibal family, and welcome to the Deconstructing Hannibal podcast, where we take the show apart piece by piece. This is Sahaya, and the guest this week is c'est moi. It's me again. I will have a guest next week, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on. But in this episode, I'm going to be discussing the motifs and continuing with motifs. Last week, I talked about mirrors and breakfast. Mirrors is a motif that in Hannibal, that continues in Brian Fuller's Hannibal, that continues from season 1 all the way into season 3. Got a lot of it in season 3. Breakfast is kind of isolated in season 1. There's a little instance in season 2, okay? However, the motifs I'm going to be discussing this week are very central to the show, and continue throughout all of the seasons. And when I tell you what those motifs are, it's going to make sense to you why they continue through the entire seasons, because it's a show about a serial killer who favors a certain type of instrument. So the motifs that I'm going to be talking about this week in season 1 are knives and scars. Okay. Hannibal uses all sorts of weapons. There's all sorts of weapons in the show, guns. He uses an extension cord. He uses a comb. He uses a stag statue. He uses scalpels. He uses all sorts of weapons, hammers. I really wish we had seen that hammer scene in season 3. But obviously his favorite is knives, not just for cooking, but for killing, right? Those of you that have never read the book Hannibal, in Hannibal, when Hannibal returns from Italy to the United States, he needs to get weapons and supplies. And so he goes to this sort of regional gun and knife show. And because it's easier to buy things there without any sort of background check and stuff. Sometimes as long as you've got the cash, it's here's your gun, here's your knife. Anyway, Hannibal buys 2 knives at that show. He buys a Spyderco Harpy and a Spyderco Civilian, okay? And Spyderco, I grew up with a dad who loved knives. I have had a couple of romantic partners who loved knives. And Spyderco is one of the best brands that you can get. I actually, for a reward for myself, a couple years back, I bought myself a Spyderco Harpy. The Civilian looks like the Harpy. It's just a little bigger, and it's basically this very curved blade that looks almost like a bird's talon. It's really pointy at the point, and then it's got a very serrated blade. So, like, if you saw someone pull this knife on you, you'd be like, "Oh my god!" It is a really terrifying knife, right? So Hannibal is definitely a knife guy, right? But also there's other people in the show using knives, okay? It's the most common type of weapon in the show, okay? And the other motif being scars, which are, knives and scars are kind of always connected. Knives create wounds, wounds become scars, okay? Okay, so jumping right in, talking about knives, okay? I want to give a little background of some research that I've done on sort of the universal symbology of knives sort of through time, okay? From J.E. Cirlot's Dictionary of Symbols, which is a sort of older book, he says, knives are associated with vengeance and death, but also sacrifice. Obviously, you can see the sort of sacrificial link to knives, right? The short blade of the knife represents, by analogy, the primacy of the instinctive forces of the man wielding it. He says man because obviously this is an older book and patriarchy, right? So the primacy of the person wielding it or the human wielding it. And that word primacy is important, okay? Merriam-Webster defines the word primacy as the state of being first, as in importance, order, or rank. So you think about things like prime or primo or etc. That means, first, right? And so the idea being that the knife represents the importance of the instinct in the person wielding it. Okay, so it represents that person's instinctual forces. okay? Which with a lot of people, you can see that extension, okay? It's an extension of their instinct, right? Then from another reference work I have called Signs and Symbols, they mention that although knives are symbolic of death and sacrifice, for example, the Aztecs used stone and obsidian knives to cut out a victim's heart, which we have in Hannibal. We've got some cutting out of hearts, right? Knives can also represent severance, meaning cutting yourself free from something or cutting something free from something else, right? And in Buddhism, the knife cuts through the bonds of ignorance. So you think about all the times in Hannibal when somebody has been wounded with a knife by someone else, and it definitely immediately changes their perspective on their relationship to the person that just cut them with that knife, okay? So I looked through all the scripts of season 1 of Hannibal, okay? And I searched for terms. I'm starting with knives here. I searched for knife, knives, blade, stab, cut, slice, slash, and it's very interesting to go through a script and search for the word cut because you get a lot of cuts that have nothing to do with knives, obviously. Cut, smash, cut, smash, cut. The word cut inside the word executive producer. It's an interesting way to spend one's time. Anyway, but I'm that insane. And so I looked at all of what I considered to be the significant knives in these scripts, not necessarily wind eating or, things like that. And I identify the meaning of knives in season 1 of Hannibal, and this continues into the other seasons, as that of power, okay? So the knife represents someone wielding their power, someone attempting to gain power, or someone attempting to regain power that they've lost, okay? Hence the primacy, right? Because that person is asserting the importance of their instinct in that moment, okay? I am going to use this knife to assert myself, right? My power, okay? So let's start by talking about, let's begin at the beginning and start with Garrett Jacob Hobbs in Apéritif, okay? He is a classic example of attempting to wield power over his family. And we don't see a lot of how what kind of father he is other than the murder, or we see a little bit with Abigail, like they go hunting or whatever. Her bringing him lunch at the work site, right? We don't see really anything about what kind of husband he is to Mrs. Hobbs, whose name is Louise Hobbs. But you have to assume that he is a very controlling force in his household, that he's very controlling of his wife and his daughter, that nobody goes anywhere without him knowing it, and nobody spends any money without him knowing it, that type of thing. Because that seems petty in consideration of that the ultimate power he wants to wield over his daughter is that of her life. If you think about it, the most power that you can wield over any other human being is that you can give them life or take their life from them. Okay. I'm rereading Frankenstein right now, and of course I outed myself to you guys as an English teacher last week, so my students are reading Frankenstein right now, and so we're having a lot of discussions about the creating of life and the taking of life, right? So with Garrett Jacob Hobbs, he can't take his daughter's life, because if he takes his daughter's life, then he won't have her anymore. It's a can't have your cake and eat it too type of circumstance. So he kills surrogates, right? So he can wield that power using knives. He always uses knives over others, right? When Hannibal and Alana and Will and Jack and Abigail visit the Hobbs cabin in Potage, and eventually they find Marissa Schuur up there, and the blood drips down and everything. Before that happens, Abigail tells them about her father. She says, "Before he cut my throat, he told me he killed those girls so he wouldn't have to kill me, right? He had to wield that power over someone, the power being that he wanted to consume Abigail, right? But if he consumed her, then he wouldn't have her anymore. So it's almost like he would take her away from himself by doing that. So he had to fulfill that need, that desire, by doing it to others who looked like her. So it was always sort of a cosplaying Abigail's murder, right? It's role play, basically. Garrett Jacob Hobbs felt the need to assert his power in the world, in his world, like in his home world, because in his workday world, he's clearly not a very powerful man. He's a pipe fitter. He appears to be a good pipe fitter, but he's subordinate to any number of bosses, right? And so this is actually a very common thing that you see with some, I'm going to say it, men, that if in their work life, they're very subordinate, that then they try to assert that dominance that they feel that they've been robbed of in the real world in their home life, sort of in the idea being the home is the man's castle and whatever, and that every man can be a king once he gets home, right? And so Garrett Jacob Hobbs is trying to assert his power over things that he can control. For example, the animals he hunts. He even uses every part of them, even turns their leg bones into knives, okay? And the girls he kills and his family, okay? And he uses knives to do all of these things, right? When it becomes, i.e. when we get to Apéritif and he kills his wife and his daughter, right? When it becomes obvious that the police are going to apprehend him and strip him of that power, Garrett Jacob Hobbs asserts his power yet again by taking his wife's life, okay, rather bluntly and, unceremoniously taking his wife's life, and then attempts to take Abigail's life, okay? When I looked at the script, I found that Mrs. Hobbs fought him, okay? Now, Abigail she's sort of trying to fight, but if you've ever studied anything about the amygdala, that when we're threatened, we have sort of fight, flight, freeze. There's fight, flight, freeze, but then there's also something called fawn. And fawn is where you sort of like give the attacker whatever it is that they want, which is, I think Abigail is sort of in freeze. She is resisting a little, like trying to keep her neck down so he doesn't cut. But apparently Louise Hobbs put up a lot more of a fight, because in the directions in the script, it says her alabaster skin, this is Will looking at Mrs. Hobbs when Garrett Jacob Hobbs throws her out the door. Her alabaster skin in sharp contrast to the crimson pouring out of it, multiple wounds puncture her torso and arms. And I don't remember because we see Louise Hobbs for such a short period of time, I don't remember if you could see those wounds on screen, but if she's got multiple wounds puncturing her torso and her arms, those are defensive wounds, which means that she tried to fight him when he came at her with the knife. Possibly she received these wounds trying to protect Abigail, okay? Then we see, once Will gets into the kitchen, Garrett Jacob Hobbs behind his daughter Abigail, slashing at her throat, okay? The wide-eyed girl has her weight against him, chin tucked down, gasping for air, okay? And so you see him asserting his power, wielding his power over his wife and his daughter by attacking them with a knife, okay? This is not uncommon, this sort of murder-suicide in dysfunctional family circumstances, okay? According to the Violence Policy Center, this type of murder-suicide is not uncommon in the United States. It's estimated that 1,200 people die by way of murder-suicide in the U.S. every year. I don't even have the stats for the rest of the world, okay? So about 10 incidents a week. So there's about 10 incidents a week of murder-suicide in the United States every week, and roughly 90% of the perpetrators are male. Most of the time, the partner that is killed is an intimate partner. It's a wife, it's a girlfriend, it's a fiance, etc. And sometimes there's children, okay? I bring that up to say, because sometimes people talk about that Hannibal is sort of too gory or whatever. This instance that you're seeing here of a man about to be arrested and sent to prison for, and probably executed for horrible crimes, and so therefore he decides to take out his wife and his daughter, and you have the feeling that if Will hadn't killed him, that he would have killed himself. This is also considered suicide by cop, right? He decides he's going to take them with him, basically, okay? And there's that primacy again. What he wants is most important, which is that he doesn't want his family to live without him, right? So Garrett Jacob Hobbs wields his power over his family by taking them away from the rest of the world, and the knife he has is the means he uses to wield that power, okay? Later in Potage, we see Will dreaming that he's standing in Garrett Jacob Hobbs's place, because remember about him getting so close to the killers, that he's standing in his place behind Abigail, and that he's holding the knife to her throat. So he's dreaming that it's him, Will, doing this, and he's saying the same thing to Abigail that she reports that her father said to her. He's saying, "I'm sorry, Abigail, please just hold still. Please, I'm going to make it all go away." The idea being here, make it all go away, that he's going to make all this pain and torment and chaos go away. But it's the pain and the torment and the chaos that he has caused. If he's standing in the place of her father, that Garrett Jacob Hobbs has caused. And what he's making go away is not actually any pain or torment or chaos that she's feeling. It's the pain and torment and chaos that he's feeling. That basically the man standing in this place with the blade thinks that his feelings are so important that they eradicate the feelings of his own family, of his wife and daughter, who would prefer to survive. Okay? Now, Will imagining himself doing this could be Will grasping for power over Abigail in his mind, right? Trying to exert his power over a circumstance where others are attempting to control Abigail. Hannibal attempting to control Abigail, Jack attempting to control Abigail, Alana attempting to control Abigail, so him attempting to do so, thinking that he knows better than them, right? Jack has told them to take her back to her family home in this episode in hopes that it's going to reveal new clues or to get her to talk more, even though both Will and Alana think that it's too soon for her to go back. Perhaps it is Will trying to take control of his own psyche, which in a couple of episodes is going to begin to betray him due to the encephalitis. But he's definitely having this dream, in my opinion, as some sort of attempt to gain power. Now, it's important that for Will, this is just a dream, and he doesn't act on this. He doesn't kill Abigail in this way, right? Now, please understand, I'm not highlighting all uses of knives in season 1. I'm not talking about Hannibal using a knife on all of his victims, everybody he kills in season 1 that wind up on his dining room table, or other killers using knives on their victims, because there's other killers using knives here, or the knives used in the cooking. I'm just talking about knives that I see as significantly connected to the theme of power, okay? Because when you're looking at motif and symbol and whatever, some of them are really obvious and are like slapping you in the face, you know, like, oh, I'm the green light at the end of the dock in Great Gatsby, or I'm blood in Macbeth, you know, or I'm the implements left in I'm the objects left in the tree by Boo Radley in To Kill a Mockingbird, right? A very significant symbol, right? And some others are sort of, you have to kind of hunt for the meaning a little bit more. And obviously, I was just having a conversation with my brother about this last night about how he's just not a literature guy because he doesn't like there being like multiple interpretations. He likes facts. I like multiple interpretations. And so this is my sort of interpretation. You might think that knives represent something else, but I'm making a case to you that in Hannibal, they're about power. This is my opinion, but I'm making the best case I can, right? Anyway, the next important use of knives that we see is when Abigail kills Nick Boyle, okay? Guts him like her father teaches her how to gut an animal, right? This happens at the end of Potage. By that point, Abigail has had a really fucking bad day, okay? Her tension has been building through the whole episode. They get to her house, and people have graffitied the word cannibals all over it. She mentions the thing about, you be my mom, you be my dad, and you be the man on the phone, making that eye contact with Hannibal, showing him that at some point she has realized that he was, through his voice, that he was the man on the phone, and keeping that a secret. Then you have Nick Boyle first accosting her in the backyard when she's talking to Marissa. Then you have Marissa being murdered. Then you have Marissa's mom coming to the house and screaming at her, "Why did you come back?" and da-da-da-da. Then she's sitting in the den of her house trying to calm down and opens a pillow and discovers hair from the dead girls inside the pillow. It is at that moment that all of this stuff has converged on her, like emotion-wise, that Nick Boyle poofs up and accosts her. Okay? Quite frankly, I actually think that what Abigail was doing was self-defense, quite frankly. It's just that she was already in a very difficult situation to begin with, and he picked a really bad time. No, that's not necessarily good defense for murder, but I believe there is a certain amount of self-defense going on here. The script says here, Nick stiffens suddenly, his eyes going wide, as the camera reveals that Abigail has plunged a kitchen knife. And as I think in the actual show, that by this time I think she was holding a hunting knife, because it was laying on the table, the coffee table, as one of the exhibits that I think they were taking out of the house. That the FBI was taking out of the house, and I believe it was like in a box on the table. If I'm wrong, someone correct me. But Abigail has plunged a kitchen knife into him at his sternum. She pulls it down, gutting him in one horrible motion. This is definitely an example of Abigail trying to gain power in that moment, in a circumstance that to her feels wildly out of control, right? If anyone needs to assert power in this moment, it's Abigail. And she is unfortunately asserting it exactly the way that she's been taught to assert it, which is that you do it with violence and you do it with a knife, right? As I said before, I believe that she is definitely threatened in that moment, even if no one else seems to believe her. Everybody, even Hannibal, immediately says, "This isn't murder, you gutted him, da-da-da-da." Nobody really even gives her a chance to plead it as self-defense, but she is in a circumstance where she is all alone and she has to protect herself, and she uses the knife to take her power back. Did she perhaps go overboard with the the wielding of the knife? You could say so, but that's how she was taught, right? Then once again, later on, we see another important knife in Roti. This is actually a scalpel, which I'm counting as a knife. It's just a smaller, more precise knife. In Roti, we see Gideon taking his power back from Frederick Chilton, using this small, precise knife, the scalpel, which he, of course, knows how to use very well because he's a surgeon, right? We see him reclaiming his power from Chilton. He is, when he and Freddie Lowndes and Chilton are in the observatory, and he's taking his organs out to make the gift basket, which in a previous episode I called an awful basket because it's got awful and it's awful. I love a good pun, right? So he's saying to Chilton, "You got inside my head, Frederick. Now I'm getting inside you." Okay, that is definitely the words of someone trying to take their power back from someone who has taken it from them, right? So, we see Georgia Machen using a knife to try to get her power back, wrestling with her power by cutting Beth LeBeau's face open, okay? Hannibal does the same thing to Dr. Sutcliffe. They both have different motives there. Georgia is desperately trying to get some some holding point, some sort of purchase on reality, and is cutting open this woman's face in an attempt to remove what she thinks is a mask because of the Cotard syndrome, right? But it's still an attempt at gaining power, at asserting power in a very difficult situation. Hannibal is asserting his power by giving Dr. Sutcliffe the Glasgow smile to make it look like the Beth LeBeau murder that he's planning to frame Will for. So he's taking his power back in. Y'all aren't going to put me in prison. Not now. So it's definitely all about power. And you're going to say, perhaps at a certain point, like, aren't you being a little pedantic here? Like, obviously, the usage of weapons is about power, right? But I'm saying that specifically knives are that in Hannibal, as opposed to the other weapons per se. The guns used in Hannibal, for example, are used in so many circumstances involving the FBI and whatnot that they're a lot more impersonal. A lot of the knives that we see being used in Hannibal are being used in very personal ways. They're being used because you have to remember that in order to kill someone with a knife, you have to get very up close and personal, like that knife murder in Saving Private Ryan, that scene that just goes on forever and it's interminable, and it's so graphic in how long and what it takes to actually kill someone with a knife, right? You can't do it from a distance the way you do with a gun, right? And so to me, the knives in Hannibal are specifically about wielding that power, because it's wielding power over someone that you're usually intimate with in some sort of way. Someone, it's family, it's friends, it's people you work with, it's people that you are your patient. Do you see what I'm saying? So knives are more about power than the other weapons are, in my opinion. Okay. In the paternal power that we see that's wielded over Abigail, so the power of the fathers, we see Garrett Jacob Hobbs trying to assert it with a knife. Then we see Will fantasizing about asserting it with a knife in a dream. And then we see Hannibal actually asserting it a couple of times, most likely with a scalpel at the end of season 1 when he takes her ear off, when he removes her ear. We never see the taking of the ear off. We see him suggest the taking of the ear off in season 3, right? But obviously he uses a scalpel, which is, once again, a knife, to do that. And there he's taking the power there to continue to frame Will to save himself. And he obviously phrases it also to Abigail as saving her as well, that he's taking that power. So he's taking the paternal power over Abigail there, all right, with the knife. The man that has paternal control over Abigail, takes it with a knife, okay? And then obviously that continues into season 2, okay? So that's sort of my ideas about knives in season 1, okay? Now, of course, the link here is that knives create wounds and wounds become scars, okay? So the second motif I'm talking about here is scars, okay? I've got some critical information here to use here. Scars are a little more difficult to find information on with regards to symbolism of them, because they are, I would say, not necessarily as iconic as weapons. And it can seem sometimes like the scar is often very situational, based on the situation in which the person received the scar, and if it was an accident, or if it was intentional, or if it was as a result of surgery, or etc. However, I have found some things that I can apply here to kind of foreground my argument, okay? I found an article by by a man named Daniel Balderston. And he's talking about knives in the work of Argentinian magical realist Jorge Luis Borges. Okay. So this article is called The Mark of the Knife, Scars as Signs in Borges. And it's kind of, I think it's sort of apropos because there's a definite case to be made that a good deal of Bryan's work could be interpreted as magical realism. Definitely Dust Bunny, in my opinion, is. It's not surrealism, but in my opinion, it's magical realism. And Hannibal has magically realistic circumstances to it because there's things that are happening in it sometimes that you are not sure if this is a dream, if this is a hallucination, if this is really happening. And it doesn't just happen to Will. There's characters that have visions, let's say, or seem like they're having some sort of vision that you can't tell if that's something that's actually happening to the character or if we just all of a sudden got artistic. You know, like, for example, Alana drowning in the black water. She's describing a dream that she has, but we see it happening. So is Alana dreaming in that circumstance, certain stance, you know? Or like in season 3, when Will goes into the church in Primavera and imaginary Abigail follows him and the priest seems to see her. Okay, and there's a lot of argument about whether he sees her there or whatever. So there's definitely many qualities of magical realism in Bryan's work. So this, you know, this is a little apropos. So he's, Balderston is talking about the scars in Borges's work, and he says that scars on characters, he says that they can be both repulsive and fascinating, sort of at the same time, that scars can be repulsive and fascinating. And he says that they act for the reader, or in this, the viewer, as a sign of past and future violence, okay? That this person received a scar as a result of past violence, and perhaps that they could be a person who engages in violence in the future because obviously they have had a violent past, right? He calls scars marks left by the past that are signs that constitute a coded language that evokes untold stories of violence and betrayal. And we definitely have scars representing betrayal in Hannibal. Abigail being betrayed by her father. Abigail's mom being betrayed by her husband, etc. Okay. Also, to get a little more scar information, I found a very fascinating blog at the Joseph Campbell Foundation. And if you don't know about Joseph Campbell, he was a mythologer, very famous for his monomyth. You know, he compared myths in all sorts of different cultures to each other and, you know, talked about the myths that cultures have in common, that these cultures have a flood myth and these cultures have a, you know, that in their beginning of the world myth, the things that are similar, the end of the world myth, the things that are similar, etc. And so there's a Joseph Campbell Foundation, and attached to that, they have a blog called Myth Blast. And so a man named Bradley Olson, PhD author and psychotherapist, he's writing about the ancient origins of the word scar. And he says, the word scar is derived from the Greek word ishara, which means place of fire. Scar quite literally means the place of fire. The fire is found within the scar, and the scar is already present in the fire. And he, you know, purports that possibly the word scar means place of fire because of like a burning sensation that happens when the cut happens, or perhaps as the cut is healing into the scar, the sort of burning sensation there. But literally the word scar means place of fire, okay? He says the most familiar English usage defines a scar as a mark left on the skin after a surface injury or wound is healed. Scars commemorate and memorialize. They freeze time, space, and emotion in pale, sometimes jagged and awkwardly knitted lines on the skin, and not infrequently, they leave a jagged signature upon the heart as well, which is true. Sometimes when we receive a scar, especially if we're receiving a scar from someone that we love, then the wound in our heart and the scar that develops in our heart is much more long-lasting than the scar on our physical body, right? He says that scars serve as a means of identification, an ancient way of tendering or proffering one's identity. And that is definitely true in fiction, that you have a character very often identified by a scar, that they have this scar across their face. The famous one is Harry Potter. I never read the Harry Potter books, so I don't know. But nobody come for me. I'm not reading them now, obviously, because of the fact that the author is a complete turf. But I mean, I'm just not. I was a Lemony Snicket person. Everybody's like, you have to read Harry Potter. And I'm like, no, thank you. I don't feel like it. I'm sorry. No offense to any Harry Potter fans out there, but it's not my jam. Anyway, and I like me some wizards and dragons and swords, but that's not my jam. Anyway, but the point is that scars are very often used in literature to identify a character, right? But also they can be attached to our own identity, right? And he says, whenever two previously unrelated things are joined together in a scar, which is a seam, he says, or a seam, if you will, is always the result. And when individuals are joined to previously unknown and unconscious aspects of themselves, scarring is the painful and inescapable result. For all of our characters in Hannibal, when they are attacked with a knife that then creates a wound that then causes a scar, okay, then it definitely not only teaches them something about the person who did this to them, but it teaches them something about themselves. And that's true in real life. There's no way that you get a scar that generally, at least as long as you're old enough to be emotionally cognizant of it, that you don't reflect on how the scar got on you and what you had to do with the scar getting there. If you were in some way connected to how the scar got there, or how you could have stopped the scar from getting there, or if you're proud of the scar that's there, or if you're ashamed of the scar that's there, there's all sorts of feelings that you can have about it based on the circumstance where it came from, which also start to become part of your identity, right? So, these meanings, those of memorialization and identity, are obviously apropos of scars in Hannibal. But I also, in this circumstance, looking at the scars in season 1 of Hannibal, okay, and I'm going to say going into the other seasons as well. And I will return to these motifs in the other seasons, but since I'm covering them in a lot of depth here, I'll probably just sort of dust over them a little. But so I identify the meaning of scars in Hannibal as a twofold meaning, okay? The meaning is twofold based on sort of the meaning for the person who is doing the scarring, okay? So for the person doing the scarring, so doing the cutting, which turns into the wound and becomes the scar, it symbolizes possession, okay? For the person being scarred, it symbolizes a new alignment of their identity as the possessed, okay? And I don't mean possessed like, ooh, like your mother sucks cocks in hell, like not that type of possession. I mean some ownership, like being owned, okay? So I had to pick that line from The Exorcist. So the person making the scar is possessing, and the person being scarred is being possessed, being owned. Okay, being taken ownership of, right? And so the people with the scar have to take that into account of their identity. An identity that no one in Hannibal is ever really able to change. Like they are never, once they're scarred, they're never able to drop off that scar as part of their identity. They're never able to fully shed themselves of the possession of that person. And maybe that's just speaking about the reality of life. And, you know, I'm a person that I've thought about a lot of this over my life, and people talk about closure, how you need to do this or that to get closure. And I finally decided I don't believe in closure. I don't think that sometimes you get it. Even if you do get it, I never found that it necessarily made me feel as great as people said the closure was going to make me feel. Really, you just go on. You just have to keep going. And eventually, to me, the thing that is more important, or that happens more frequently, is just time. It's just that time, eventually things don't hurt as much as they once did. They never really go away, but it doesn't hurt as much as it once used to. In my mind, there's really no such thing as closure. And if you believe differently, that's fine. But the people in Hannibal, there's no closure for them. There's just going on, okay? The scar on you in Hannibal is forever, and so is the possession, okay? So, for example, Garrett Jacob Hobbs's desire to kill his daughter is about many things, and some of them are so tangled I can't even get into it right now. But one of the most predominant is his desire to possess her, okay? Because he knows that his desire for possession ultimately culminates in consumption, meaning he kills her and eats her. And that then once he does that, he won't have her anymore, right? In the real world, he tries to stave it off by killing and consuming surrogates. There are no scars left on the girls that he kills because they don't survive. Abigail, however, does. So from Potage, Abigail Hobbs is looking in the mirror, and I talked about this last episode with the mirror, but she's looking in the mirror. It says, the bandages on her neck have been removed, and we see fresh, angry scars above her white slip. She runs her fingers across the wound before tying a scarf around her neck to conceal it from the world. And then Abigail says, I can hide what happened to me. All I need is a scarf to pass. Okay? When Abigail looks in the mirror, she knows she has to forge a new identity. Her mom is dead. Her dad is dead. Her father is a notorious serial killer. She's got to, even Freddie Lowndes even talks to her about that she's got to create her new identity in her new life, right? But she is forever marked here by her father's possession. She tries to escape, but then later she's scarred again by a surrogate father when Hannibal removes her ear, and then receives the same wound in the same place in Mizumono in season 2 when Hannibal cuts her there and kills her. Okay? Possession of Abigail passes from Garrett Jacob Hobbs to Hannibal and never to herself. She never fully owns herself. Her father owned her, and then that ownership passed to Hannibal. It passed to Hannibal when he saved her life, and then it passed to Hannibal when he took it. Unfortunately, she is never allowed to own herself. She never can become what Abigail Hobbs is supposed to become, okay? Will goes through the desire of wanting to possess her, and he fantasizes about wanting to possess her, but Hannibal takes that ownership, okay? Will even echoes this sentiment about Hannibal owning Abigail and sort of taking her away in season 3 when in Primavera, when he's in the chapel and he's talking to imaginary Abigail, and he says, he gave you back to me, then took you away. It's like Lucy with the football. He just keeps pulling you away. Hannibal can only pull away something that he has possession and control over. Lucy owns the football. Hannibal owns Abigail, okay? So scars in Hannibal, from the point of view of the person doing the scarring, is attempting to gain possession, and then the victim of the scar has to then deal with that, the fact that they are possessed, that they are owned, okay? In season 1, Will receives a scar from Jack's shot to his shoulder in Savro, and so this is a circumstance where we actually have ownership being passed here, not with a knife, but with a gun, okay? And it obviously forms a scar, right? As I said, guns don't have quite the same meaning, okay? They're a little more impersonal. However, Jack shooting Will here and scarring him is very personal. And we see then Jack taking Will's power away from him, because Jack takes Will into his possession and then deposits him into the federal government's possession by placing him in the BSHCI. He literally takes possession of Will, okay? And he does that first by wounding him in a way that causes a scar. The scar will always be a mark of possession on Will from Jack, okay? I have often maintained that a good deal of what is going on between Hannibal and Jack throughout the show is them fighting over possession of Will. Perhaps for for Hannibal, it eventually becomes romantically tinged, but they both are fighting over who Will belongs to. You see it happen in Mizumono when Jack says to Will, Hannibal thinks you're his man in the room. I think you're mine. Okay? If you take that out of context, it's pretty point blank. I think you're mine. Okay? I think that's why Jack wants Will to kill Hannibal in season 3 when Will asks him, about what happened in Contorno, what you had your chance, why didn't you kill him, Jack? And Jack says, I think I wanted you to, because he wants Will to kill Hannibal to prove his loyalty to him, right? So once again, we have a scar being put on someone here, this time with a gun. Very rarely does it happen with a gun, but it does here because that's Jack's weapon, right? Jack is not a knife wielder. He's a gun guy, right? That then causes him to have possession of Will. And that is a part of possession that will always be on Will. If you think about it, Will has scars from Hannibal. He has scars from Jack. Both of those men have owned him at some point in the show. Okay? So if you think about it, when he and Hannibal go over the cliff in Wrath of the Lamb, which is going to cause any number of scars, assuming that they survive, you got Dollarhide stabbing him in the face and everything, stabbing him in the shoulder, which is going to cause scars. Okay, this is Dollarhide's attempt to gain possession by taking Will's life. Will eventually, he pulls himself over the cliff, basically I'm about to cause a bunch of scars on myself and I'm finally taking possession of myself, right? Anyway, there's a bit of a jump forward, but now, of course, all right, hang on, y'all. I'm going to get Freudian here. It would be remiss of me to not mention the classic Freudian implications of knives and scars, in which that blades, especially long ones, swords, also any other sort of long-ranged weapon, a staff, a lance, etc., have been associated with the penis, with the phallus, right? And wounds have been associated with vaginas and wombs, because wounds are a big open slit. They bleed in the way that vaginas can bleed, etc. Okay? So if you think about it that way, if a knife is the phallus and the wound is the vagina, right? Then the scars are the aftermath of coitus. They're the aftermath of sexual intercourse is what the scar is. So the wound is the child of the blade's union with the flesh, right? But a scar is when a wound heals. So the outward scar of the wounding is a more egoistic marking. And so people can see this, I have possessed this person, okay? This is why things are branded, okay? This is why people put collars on their pets, etc. People get tattoos of other people's names on them, etc. It's showing possession, okay? And so that's sort of, the idea that I have there of the possession with regards to the scars. It's just like Bedelia asserts to Will in season 3 about the smile that he got in Mizumono, so about the big scar that he got in Mizumono. Bedelia says, it excites him to see you marked in this particular way, meaning Hannibal, because that means that Will can never truly get away from Hannibal. Hannibal has laid his claim and he marks Will in order to possess him for the rest of his life. Every time Will takes a shower, looks in the mirror, he's going to see that scar and he will remember Hannibal. Hannibal will live rent-free in his head for the rest of his life. even if you had the season 3 events didn't happen and Will stays with Molly and Walter and whatever, that scar of ownership is on Will for the rest of his life. He might have a ring on his finger to represent that he's made some sort of promise to Molly, but his ass belongs to Hannibal Lecter. If you will, give me a bit of a colloquialism. I have briefly mentioned, okay, that the continuation of the motifs and of knives and scars obviously persist into seasons 2 and 3, and I've mentioned a couple of the instances here, and I'm going to discuss those in more detail when I get to those episodes. But in order to sort of summarize the meaning of both of the motifs that I'm talking about here, the upshot is that knives are about power, the wielding of power, and the people we hurt when we wield our power selfishly. So in order to relate this to sort of a universal theme, because remember, I'm relating motif to theme, knives are about that power, how we wield our power, and who we hurt if we wield our power in a selfish or reckless manner, okay? They're about the attempts for us to wield our own power in circumstances where we feel out of control. Okay, the idea being here that humans, when they often feel out of control, will lash out in a violent way. Sometimes you have to in order to protect yourself, to save your own life, to save others' lives. And sometimes people lash out with violence because that's how they've been taught. There's a certain amount of it that's instinctual, that's from our lizard brain. And then there's a certain amount of it is, hurt people, right? Scars, so that's knives. Scars are the aftermath of these power events. Scars are how we are changed, how we are marked, okay, from the events in our lives, and how then we form new identities based on those events, okay? How much we determine that we're going to let that event that scarred us, either physically scarred us or emotionally scarred us, how much we're going to let that be a part of us and be a part of our identity, and how much we're going to let it change our lives going into the future. I'm sure you, my viewer that I'm talking to, you've had some shit happen to you. I have had some shit happen to me. We've all had shit happen to us, right? Some folks have had a lot of shit happen to them. Some folks have had not as much, but it's all relative, right? What happened to you is no less important than what happened to me. But we all have to find a way to bear our scars and decide how much, because a lot of times the scars that we're bearing have been done to us by other people. And so we have to find a way to accept that scar into our identities and our lives without it tainting our future, without it being what we are going forward, that we are not a wounded victim, but we are a survivor, right? In Oeuf, Hannibal tells Abigail, our scars have the power to remind us that the past was real, okay? When we look at our scars, they can offer us warnings about paths we no longer want to go down, or habits we no longer want to have, people we no longer want to associate with, things we no longer want to do. They can offer us memories of things that happened to us in the past that perhaps we had no control over or did have control over. They can offer us advice on how to change things in the future. But most ultimately, as Bedelia says to Will in season 2, you can survive this happening to you. Okay? The traumatized are unpredictable because they know that they can survive. Our scars remind us that we survived. Okay? Therefore, our scars are to be cherished because they are evidence that we are still alive. Okay? Only survivors bear scars. Okay? I did read in one of my articles that I didn't wind up using about a Catholic saint named Saint Lutgard who got a wound, and then it turned into a scar after her death, and then the wound, when people went to her body and touched the wound, the scar that she had it on the neck, that touched the scar that had developed there after her death, that it then healed them. Okay. Good for St. Lutgard. But for most of us, we don't have scars developing after we die. Okay. So if you have a scar, you be proud of your scar, because that means that you survived and that you can survive. Okay. And I believe that's also one of the messages that Bryan was trying to get forth to us in Hannibal with regards to scars, is that scars are for the strong. Because, and I'm not saying that some people that didn't get through scars, that didn't live long enough to get scars, weren't strong, but they are living proof to you when you look at them that you can get through this. You can keep going. Okay? So that is Knives and Scars. Okay? And as I said, I'll talk more about those in season 2. Okay? So let me go ahead and share some information with you guys to wrap this up. If you want to offer me any comments, any feedback, if you're Hannibal family and you think that you might want to be on a future episode, you can reach out to me at my socials. Blue Sky, I'm Sahaya74. Instagram, I'm Sahaya the Hannibal. I have a Patreon now, Deconstructing Hannibal, and my YouTube channel, Deconstructing Hannibal with Sahaya. So you guys make sure to like and subscribe. Dust Bunny is out in most places, or I'm going to say a lot of places, on video on demand. So you can watch it on, I know Amazon, but I'm sure there's other streaming services. I know that there are other parts of the globe that have not gotten Dust Bunny yet. And for those of you international Hannibals that haven't seen it yet, I'm so sorry. I hope it comes to you soon. Whenever it comes to you, watch it as soon as possible. Watch it many times. Okay. I read online a couple days ago that Bryan's got a couple more movies in him. He talks about he's got a couple more screenplays in him, but he's also working on a new TV project with Clive Barker. So that is perfect. So I can't wait to see what that is. Okay. My next episode, which will be episode 30. And those of you that have been with me through this process here, you know that every 10 episodes, I stop and do one of the Hannibal movies. So episode 10, we did Manhunter. Episode 20, we did Silence of the Lambs. And so now for episode 30, it's time for the next Hannibal film chronologically, which is Ridley Scott's 2001 movie, Hannibal, which is the telling of the story of the Hannibal novel, Hannibal's in Italy, and and it's got Julianne Moore starring as Clarice Starling, because Jodie Foster didn't come back for the project, right? So I will be talking about the 2001 film Hannibal with my my always lovely movie guest that I have for those, who is Lady Thunder. So that episode will be coming up in the next couple of weeks. Y'all be looking out for it. And I want to say to you guys, as I always say, first off, my Hannibal family, I love you. The world is a tough place right now. It is, yeah. So if you are struggling and you need help, please reach out to a Hannibal you can trust. Remember, we are here for each other. I love you guys. Bryan, if you're listening or you're watching, I love you. I hope the Clive Barker project is going well. It sounds really exciting. And congratulations on the Saturn Award. Guys, if y'all don't know, Bryan and everybody on the project won the Saturn Award for the best indie film, best independent film. So that was really great. And Sigourney won for best supporting actress for Dust Bunny. So anyway, so I love my Hannibals. I love you, Bryan. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And as I always say, remember, it is fine to be weird, because all the best people are. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Bye.